The smell hit Veska nowhere before she cleared the docking ramp, and her crest feathers flattened in pure reflex. It was wrong. Not dangerous wrong, her toxin glands would have fired for that, but categorically wrong. The way a chord played in a key that shouldn't exist was wrong. Fat rendering in open air. Protein searing at temperatures no civilized kitchen would permit. Something caramelizing with a sweetness that had no analog in the Vorani Flavor Index, which cataloged 11,412 distinct molecular taste profiles across 900 species, and had never, in its 4-century history, needed a supplement. Veska's quill stylus was already moving across her glass tablet before her taloned feet touched the station deck. Unidentified thermal aromatics, she wrote, crude technique, Maillard-adjacent reaction profile but uncontrolled, likely accidental rather than intentional. Possible contaminant, will investigate. She was, at that moment, the most decorated food critic in the Vorani Culinary Directorate's 300-year history. 17 published volumes of cross-species gastronomic analysis, 9 precision palate citations, 2 volumes translated into Pelathi chemical notation, which was considered such a high honor that the Pelathi ambassador had personally presented her with a crystallized enzyme sculpture of her own palatal grid, accurate to the cellular level. The only non-directorate-born avian ever granted a permanent reviewing chair on the Galactic Cuisine Evaluation Board, a body so exclusive that its 12 members received diplomatic immunity in 41 systems, so that their reviews could never be challenged in civil court. Her species, the Vorani, had evolved with 16 palatal analysis glands arranged in a grid across the upper palate, each one tuned to a different compound family. Veska's had been professionally trained for so long that she could detect a 3-part per billion variance in allium sulfoxide concentration between 2 otherwise identical preparations. She had once rejected a Tourai Master Chef's crystal gel entry because the 3rd-layer resonance was off by a margin that the chef himself could not detect with his own equipment. The chef had later confirmed the defect with an electron-level scan and sent Veska a formal note of professional respect that she kept framed in her office beside her 9 citations. She was precise. She was rigorous. She was here because something impossible had happened, and she was going to find the explanation and correct the record. 3 cycles ago, at the 190th Annual Galactic Gastronomy Exhibition on Vestara Prime, the most prestigious competitive cooking event in the known galaxy, an invitation-only showcase where the finest culinary artists from 200 species presented their masterworks to the board, a human had entered. That alone wasn't news. Humans had been submitting applications for 7 years running. The board rejected them as a matter of course. Human cuisine was a known quantity, thermal abuse of raw ingredients, excessive reliance on fat and salt, no molecular precision, no layered flavor architecture, no controlled enzymatic staging. The Vorani Flavor Index had a classification for it. Category 11K, Primitive Subsistence Preparations Thermal. It sat between Category 11J, Fermented Slurry Cultures, and Category 11L, Raw Consumption Without Preparation, and the placement was, in Veska's professional opinion, generous. But this year, through some bureaucratic error that 3 separate directorate committees were still investigating, a human application had been processed, approved, and assigned a competition slot before anyone with authority noticed. The human's name was Demetria Stavros. She was 53 years old. Her listed credentials were 31 years of feeding people. No formal training. No molecular certification. No enzymatic staging license. Her competition entry was listed on the registration form as Family Recipe Lamb. The board had allowed her to compete because withdrawing an approved slot required a unanimous override vote. An adjudicator, Presk, the Grenari crustacean who held Chair 9, and had spent 40 years building his reputation as a procedural absolutist, refused to vote for an override on the grounds that the paperwork was technically in order. He'd made it clear he considered the human's entry a waste of the board's time, but he would not compromise process to remove it. Veska had been present when Demetria Stavros walked into the exhibition hall on Veshtara Prime. The memory was vivid enough to make her crest feathers itch even now, 3 cycles later, standing on a station docking ramp with that impossible smell. The exhibition hall was a cathedral of culinary precision, temperature controlled to within 1/10 of a degree, humidity locked, lighting calibrated to present molecular compositions at their spectral best. 200 competition stations, each equipped with enzymatic staging chambers, flavor spectrum analyzers, molecular assembly rigs, and precision thermal arrays that could hold a compound at any temperature for as long as the preparation required. The combined value of the equipment on the hall floor exceeded the annual budget of most planetary governments. Demetria Stavros had walked past all of it carrying a cloth bag. She had set up at her assigned station number 174, between a Vorani molecular collective that had brought 6 technicians and a Palathi enzyme sculptor whose preparation chamber alone weighed more than a ground transport, and unpacked her tools one by one. A heavy ceramic dish, a bottle of golden liquid, a bundle of dried herbs wrapped in cloth, a ceramic jug of citrus juice, hand-squeezed. A bulb of allium that she cracked open with the heel of her hand on the station's precision work surface, leaving a smear that 3 cleaning drones converged on in alarm. A coil of parchment paper, and a piece of protein lamb. Her registration said that she unwrapped from a secondary cloth covering and laid on the surface, as if she were settling a sleeping child into bed. No enzymatic staging chamber, no molecular tools, no analyzer of any kind. The Vorani collective at station 173 had stopped their prep sequence to stare. Their lead technician, a narrow-faced male with immaculate plumage, had turned to his team with an expression that communicated without words, a mixture of professional bewilderment and mild offense. The Palathi enzyme sculptor at station 175 had paused mid-calibration, her smooth, wet-skinned fingers hovering above her staging chamber, sensory membranes dilating as she processed what she was seeing. Chair 3, the Turai judge, had leaned toward Veska at the evaluation bench. "Is this a protest of some kind?" "It appears to be an entry," Veska had said. "Should we be concerned?" "We should be patient." Procedural integrity. She had meant it dismissively. The human's entry would score in the low 20s, the range reserved for technically valid but culinarily insignificant submissions, and that would be the end of it. That had not been the end of it. Demetria Stavros had cooked. She had rubbed the lamb with lemon juice and crushed garlic and torn oregano and olive oil, working the marinade into the meat with her bare hands. She had wrapped the lamb in parchment paper, sealed it in the ceramic dish, and placed it in the station's oven at a temperature so low that the thermal monitoring system flagged it as an error. And then she had waited. For 5 hours. The exhibition ran for 6. Other competitors worked their stations with focused intensity, molecular assemblies clicking into place, enzyme cascades initiated and monitored, crystal gel matrices seeded and grown under spectral lamps. The Vorani collective at 173 produced a molecular composition that required 218 precisely timed staging interventions, each one logged, each one adjusting the flavor architecture by measurable degrees. The Palathi sculptor at 175 produced a 3-tier enzyme cascade that took 90 minutes and contained 418 precisely staged reactions. Demetria Stavros sat on a stool beside the oven. She hummed. She folded the cloth bag into a smaller square. She smoothed her apron. At the 3-hour mark, she opened the oven door, leaned close, inhaled once, closed the door, and sat back down. Chair 3 had leaned toward Veska again. "What is she doing?" "Checking on her entry." "By smelling it." "Apparently." "Is that legal?" Vesca had consulted the exhibition charter on her tablet. The charter specifies that competitors may monitor their preparations using any technique available to them. It does not specify that the technique must involve equipment. Chair 3's ear membranes had twitched. The Vorani Collective lead technician at 173, who had been monitoring his molecular composition's 200th staging intervention, had paused long enough to watch the human inhale, sit back, and resume humming. His crest feathers did something complicated that Vesca recognized as the Vorani expression for a category error. The face you made when reality did something your taxonomy said it couldn't. When the timer went off at the 5-hour mark, Demetria had opened the parchment. The smell that escaped silenced the nearest 12 stations. The Vorani Collective lead at 173 looked up from his completed molecular composition, a masterwork of precision and staging, and his crest flattened involuntarily. The Palathi sculptor's sensory membranes dilated to their maximum aperture. She said one word in Palathi chemical notation that translated roughly as unexpected. Vesca, 15 meters away, felt her palatal glands activate, involuntary, a reflex she had not experienced since her training days. The lamb was served to the 9 judges in sealed evaluation containers. Vesca opened hers, deployed her evaluation probe, placed a measured portion on her tongue, and activated her palatal grid in full clinical mode. Her evaluation probe asked for more time. The compounds were releasing in sequence, not simultaneously, the way molecular preparations delivered them, but in waves. Each wave contained different compounds. Each compound interacted with the ones before it. The probe's algorithm needed 45 seconds to catalog the full architecture. Vesca's probe typically completed a scan in 3. Final count: 1,847 distinct flavor compounds. Category: 11K preparations, were supposed to produce between 200 and 400. Vesca had scored at 92, the second highest score she had ever given in 3 centuries. She had submitted the number because the preparation earned it, and Vesca did not lie on score sheets. 9 judges, 9 scores between 86 and 96, average 91.7. Chair 4, a Vorani purist who had never scored a non-Vorani entry above 80, had given it 96 and written, "I have no professional framework for this." Chair 5, the Granari biochemist whose mandibles were famous for never registering approval above 70, had scored at 86 and written, "Grudgingly impressed." The defending champion's crystal gel, 89.2. The results were sealed pending formal review. Vesca had insisted. During the 3-cycle transit to Ketha Ring Station, the mid-tier trading post where Demetria Stavros had returned after the competition, Vesca had done what she always did with anomalous data. She had tried to destroy it. She reviewed the scoring data 11 times. She checked the calibration logs of every evaluation probe used by the 9 judges. She cross-referenced the compound catalogs from each judge's independent scan. She ran statistical analyses on the score distributions, looking for anomalies, correlated errors, systematic bias, anything that would explain how a woman with no training had outscored the defending champion by 2.5 points. She had also pulled the exhibition hall's environmental records for the competition day: ambient temperature, humidity, airborne particulate counts, looking for any atmospheric variable that might have enhanced the human's aromatic profile. She had checked whether Demetria Stavros had been assigned a station near an air intake that might have circulated her preparations sent past the judge's bench before the formal tasting, creating an unconscious priming effect. Station 174 was, in fact, 16 meters from the nearest air circulation unit, with 2 intermediate stations between it and the judge's bench. The positioning was neutral. She had examined the sealed evaluation containers for any manufacturing defect that might have allowed cross-contamination between the human sample and the containers from other competitors. She had pulled the containers' batch numbers and compared them against the Directorate's quality control database. They were from the same manufacturing run as every other container used that day. Defect rate, 0. And she was not proud of this, quietly contacted Chair 4, the Vorani purist who had given the impossible 96, and asked him, in carefully neutral professional language, whether he had experienced any sensory anomalies during the evaluation, any moment of doubt about his probe, any unusual mental state. Chair 4 had responded with 3 sentences. My probe was operating within specifications. My palatal grid was in clinical mode. The score reflects what I tasted, and what I tasted has been keeping me awake. He had not elaborated on the last sentence, and Veska had not asked him to, because she knew exactly what he meant. She had been sleeping poorly herself. She had found nothing. The scores were clean. The equipment was calibrated. The judges had independently arrived at scores that converged within a tight range, which was exactly what happened when the stimulus was genuine. She had prepared 3 alternative explanations: scoring error, contaminated pallet banks, compromised judge. She intended to determine which one, document it, and file a correction before the results were unsealed. She had requested a formal interview through the directorate's diplomatic liaison and received, after 2 days, a response that still irritated her. Sure, come for dinner. She had not come for dinner. The smell from Bay 14 said otherwise. Veska followed it through the station's lower commercial ring, past cargo vendor stalls selling thermal-sealed nutrition blocks and enzyme-balanced drink packets, and stopped at the open bay doors. The kitchen was wrong. Long tables ran the length of the room. Bundles of dried vegetation hung from overhead hooks. Glass containers held liquids in every shade from deep amber to cloudy white. Ceramic vessels sat on every surface, some bubbling, some resting. The thermal surfaces were deliberately uneven, different heights, different temperatures, none calibrated. The ventilation was a jury-rigged cargo fan. The tools were crude metal implements. And Demetria Stavros was in the center of it all, singing. The bird lady from the judge's table, the human said when she looked up, "You found me. I am Evaluator Veska Noer. I hold Chair 7 of the Galactic Cuisine Evaluation Board. I am not a bird lady." "Of course not. Come in, I'm making pasticcio. You're staying for dinner." "I am here to conduct a formal review." "Anomalous scores." Demetria said it the way one said the weather. "You mean they were too high?" "Inconsistent with the category profile." "Too high for peasant food." Veska's stylus hovered. The human had arrived at the exact criticism in 2 sentences. "May I examine your preparation area?" "It's a kitchen, and yes, but you eat while you look." "I will not be eating." "In my kitchen, everyone eats. My mother's rule and her mother's before that." Veska stepped inside and began cataloging deviations from directorate standards. No molecular tools. No precision measurement devices. The human measured by hand, cupping powder in her palm, eyeing a liquid level, pinching herbs between her fingers. She measured by memory, by touch, by smell, by the sound of fat sizzling. "What is in that vessel?" Veska asked, pointing at the heavy-bottomed pot on the highest heat. "Sauce, tomato, garlic, onion, a little cinnamon, bay leaf, thyme." "Thyme is not an ingredient." The human gave her a look that Veska could not classify, not amusement, not pity, the look of someone who had been told that wind wasn't real. "In my kitchen," Demetria said, "it's the main one." Veska wrote, "Subject displays pre-scientific relationship with food preparation." Consistent with category 11K, she did not write what she was beginning to suspect, which was that the pre-scientific relationship might be the point rather than the deficiency. She conducted a systematic survey of the kitchen's contents. The dried vegetation bundles turned out to be, according to her analyzer, 17 different species of plant matter from earth, oregano, thyme, rosemary, bay laurel, basil, mint, sage, and 10 others that the flavor index classified collectively under herb, miscellaneous, earth origin. Each one had a distinct volatile profile. Some were common to Vorani molecular databases. Others a variety of oregano that Demetria called the good one, from the mountains, contained trace compounds that Vesca's analyzer flagged as unindexed. Not dangerous, not novel in a chemical sense, simply never encountered in a formal evaluation context because no evaluator had ever walked into a human kitchen with a molecular analyzer and bothered to scan the herbs hanging from the ceiling. The glass containers held liquids that Vesca identified as vinegar's acetic acid solutions of varying concentrations, each one produced through a different fermentation pathway and carrying its own secondary compound profile. One of them, a dark amber liquid that Demetria called the old vinegar, had a complexity rating on Vesca's analyzer that was higher than several directorate-certified flavor concentrates. "How old is this vinegar?" Vesca asked. "My mother started it. I brought it with me from Earth. About 30 years. 30 years. You add a little wine to it every year. It changes. Gets deeper. 30 years of spontaneous fermentation and compound development, carried across interstellar space in a glass bottle, maintained by the simple act of adding a little wine every year." The Directorate's fermentation division had been working on controlled long-duration flavor development for a decade and had produced results that Vesca, reviewing the latest publications on her transit, would now characterize as modest. "I need the precise technique for the competition entry, the Cleftico. I marinated it overnight in lemon and garlic and oregano and olive oil, sealed it in paper, cooked it for 5 hours at low heat. 5 hours. A Vorani precision kitchen can reconstruct a protein matrix at the molecular level in 11 minutes. "That's nice," Demetria said. "This takes 5 hours. Why?" "Because that's how long it needs." Vesca pulled out her portable molecular analyzer, a palm-sized Vorani device that could display the full flavor spectrum architecture of any substance on a holographic grid. She scanned the sauce. The display lit up. Compound after compound registered. Reds for lycopene, oranges for capsaicin-adjacent volatiles, greens for herbal terpenes, deep purples for allium derivatives. The architecture was dense. Compound count, 1,204, in a sauce made from 6 ingredients. Vesca ran the scan again. Same result. She ran a calibration check. The device was operating within specifications. "How long has this sauce been cooking?" "Since this morning." "About 6 hours." 6 hours. "It's better at 8. The temporal structure was clear in the scan. The compounds weren't just present, they were interacting, forming new compounds as the thermal process continued, a cascade of reactions growing more complex over time rather than degrading. In molecular cuisine, you assembled compounds in the desired configuration and stabilized them. In this kitchen, the compounds were assembling themselves, driven by nothing more than heat and time, and the result was a complexity that Vesca's precision framework said should not exist without intervention. She closed the display. It was telling her things she could taste. It was not telling her the things she needed to understand. A plate appeared in front of her. Pasticcio layered pasta, ground meat with cinnamon and bay leaf, a white dairy emulsion baked until it browned. She took a sample with her evaluation probe. Compound count, 923, for a dish made from memory on uneven thermal plates while singing. The starch established structure. The protein delivered umami depth. The cinnamon modulated rather than dominated. The dairy emulsion prolonged flavor release across her entire palate grid. And beneath it all, threading through every layer like a current through deep water, was the temporal element, the quality that came from ingredients in each other's company long enough to stop being separate things and start being one coherent thing. She put down her probe. She took a second piece with a spatula, without the probe, without clinical mode. The pasticcio was telling a story. That was the only framework that fit. The starch was the setting. The meat was the action. The cinnamon was the warmth. The white topping was the ending. Vesca could not professionally write that a dish told a story. She took a third piece. "How long has this recipe existed?" she asked. "My grandmother taught my mother taught me, her grandmother taught her. Before that, nobody knows. Centuries. Nobody wrote it down until recently." "You didn't write your recipes." "Not this one. You learn it by standing next to someone. You learn when the oil is right by the sound. You learn when the meat is done by the smell. You learn the dough is ready when it feels right." She held up a ball of dough, smooth and elastic, and pressed it with her thumb. It sprang back slowly. "See." Vesca saw a sphere of hydrated gluten. She could have calculated its elasticity coefficient to 4 decimal places. The calculation would have told her nothing about the taste. Over the next 3 hours, she chased the answer. And the answer kept retreating, not because the human was hiding it, but because the tool Vesca was chasing it with was the wrong tool. The pattern was always the same. Vesca asked a technical question. The human answered in terms that were not technical. Vesca tried to reclassify the response in directorate language. The reclassification failed. She asked another question. The cycle repeated. Each time, the gap between her framework and the human's reality widened. And each time, the thing on the other side of that gap became harder to dismiss as ignorance. "How do you determine the acid-to-fat ratio in your marinade?" "I taste it." "What instrument do you use to taste it?" "My mouth." "Yes, but what calibration standard do you compare the taste against?" "Against what it's supposed to taste like." "How do you know what it's supposed to taste like?" "Because I've been tasting it since I was 5. "What is the optimal thermal profile for the sealed cooking phase?" "Low enough that you could fall asleep and it'd be fine when you woke up." "That is not a thermal profile. It's the one that works." "How do you achieve enzymatic balance without staged intervention?" "I don't know what that means. The flavors know each other. They've been introduced." "How do you calibrate the cinnamon dosage to avoid masking the primary protein compounds?" "You don't put too much. You know how much is too much because you've been watching someone else not put too much since you were 4 years old." "What does done mean?" "You'll know." "How will I know?" "You're already starting to." Vesca tried a more structured approach. She asked Demetria to make a small batch of the marinade, just the lemon, garlic, oregano, and olive oil, so she could scan it at each stage. Demetria agreed, and Vesca positioned her analyzer beside the work's surface and watched. The human squeezed lemon into a bowl. No measuring device. No volumetric precision. Just a hand squeezing a citrus fruit. Vesca scanned the result. 43 milliliters of juice, pH 2.3, with a specific distribution of citric acid, ascorbic acid, and terpene volatiles from the rind oils that the human squeezing motion had expressed along with the juice. Then the garlic. Demetria crushed 2 bulbs with the flat of a knife, peeled them, and minced the cloves with rapid practice strokes. She did not weigh them. She did not count them. Vesca scanned, 28 grams, allicin concentration within the expected range for fresh allium, with a secondary sulfoxide profile that varied slightly between cloves. The variation was, according to molecular cuisine principles, a defect. Standardization required uniform raw materials. The oregano. Demetria took a pinch of dried leaves from a jar, rubbed them between her palms over the bowl, and the released volatiles hit Vesca's palatal glands like a shout in a quiet room. Thymol, carvacrol, rosmarinic acid. The scan registered 18 volatile compounds released by the mechanical action of the human's palms crushing the dried leaves, compounds that a molecular staging chamber would have extracted with precision and added individually, in calculated ratios, at calculated temperatures. The olive oil. A pour from a dark bottle, uncalibrated, approximately 35 milliliters by Veska's visual estimate. The human mixed them together with her fingers, not a stirring implement, her fingers. And Veska scanned the combined marinade and saw what she had been afraid she would see. The compound interactions had already begun. The citric acid was breaking down the allicin at the surface interface. The terpenes from the oregano were binding to the lipid fraction of the oil. The volatile profile was already more complex than the sum of its parts, and the marinade had existed for approximately 40 seconds. Molecular staging could replicate this. It would take longer, require equipment, and produce a result that was technically identical at the compound level. But Veska was beginning to suspect that technically identical at the compound level was not the same as identical, because molecular staging would produce the compounds in their final state, while this marinade was producing them in the process of becoming their final state, and the process itself was leaving traces intermediate compounds, transient interactions, reaction artifacts that a staged approach would never generate because a staged approach skipped the process entirely. The human's crude technique was producing compounds that precision made impossible. Veska did not write this down. She was not ready to commit it to the record. She ran another scan on the sauce 90 minutes after the first. Compound count, 1,341. It had gained 137 compounds. The sauce was still developing. She tried yet another approach. She asked Demetria to explain the logic behind the cinnamon, why cinnamon, specifically, in a meat sauce. She expected a compositional answer. She got a genealogical one. My grandmother's grandmother lived in a place where the spice traders came through, Demetria said, stirring the sauce with a wooden implement, wood, not even metal, a material so porous that it would absorb compounds and redistribute them in ways that no sanitary protocol would permit. The wood itself, Veska realized, was probably contributing trace compounds from years of previous use, a form of cross-contamination so thoroughgoing that it was essentially a seasoning. They brought cinnamon from somewhere far away. She put it in everything. Not because she knew the chemistry, because it tasted right. She tried it once and it stayed. It stayed, Veska repeated. 4 generations. Every woman in my family put cinnamon in the meat, not because we decided to, because the recipe decided, because the flavors wanted it. The flavors wanted it. Veska wrote it down, stared at it, drew a line through it, and then wrote it again because she didn't have a better way to describe what her palatal grid was confirming. The cinnamon was not incidental. It was functional. Its volatile compounds were interacting with the allium derivatives and the lycopene base in ways that produced synergistic effects, flavor pathways that only existed because those specific compounds were present together. 4 generations of human women had discovered these pathways not through molecular analysis, but through the radical, unscientific, devastatingly effective method of tasting the result and noticing that it was good. Veska pulled up the Vorani Flavor Index's entry on cinnamon cinnamomum verum, earth origin, volatile profile dominated by cinnamaldehyde. The index listed 63 known synergistic interactions with other compound families. The interaction with allium sulfoxides in a lycopene-rich matrix was not among them. It had not been documented because no Vorani researcher had thought to combine those 3 compound families in thermal proximity for 5 hours. The human's grandmother had thought of it, or rather, she had not thought of it at all. She had simply tried it, tasted it, and kept doing it. And the combination had propagated through 4 generations of daughters, surviving not because it was documented or understood, but because it was good. This was, Veska realized, a form of research, uncontrolled, undocumented, distributed across generations and geography, with no hypothesis, no methodology, and no publications, but research nonetheless. Every human cook who had ever added cinnamon to a meat sauce and noticed that it improved the result was conducting an experiment. Every grandmother who taught her granddaughter the correct pinch was transmitting experimental data. The human culinary tradition was a research program that had been running for thousands of years with millions of parallel researchers, none of whom had ever written a paper, none of whom had funding, none of whom knew they were participating in anything more than feeding their families. The combined dataset of that program, the accumulated tasting and adjusting of 100 generations, dwarfed anything the Vorani Culinary Directorate had produced in 3 centuries of formal study. Not in precision, in scope. The Directorate's researchers tested individual compounds in controlled environments. The human grandmothers tested entire preparations in the most uncontrolled environment imaginable, a kitchen full of crying children and boiling pots, and a mother's voice saying, "A little more, yes, like that." And the results of those tests had been refined by the most merciless quality control mechanism in existence, whether or not people came back for more. Veska stared at the wooden spoon in the sauce. She stared at the ceramic vessels on the uneven thermal plates. She stared at Demetria Stavros, who was now stretching dough between her hands with the practiced fluidity of someone performing an action so deeply learned that it had become as involuntary as breathing. She was beginning to understand something that she did not want to understand. The Category 11K classification was not merely outdated. It was the single largest evaluative failure in the Vorani Flavor Index's history. And she, Veska Noer, Chair 7, 9 citations, 17 volumes, had endorsed it for 3 centuries without ever tasting the evidence. That was the thing that was keeping her awake, not the human scores, the fact that she had never thought to check. Demetria, meanwhile, had stopped treating Veska's visit as a formal review. Station residents began arriving. The first was a Palathi freight hauler who lingered near the door until Demetria waved him in. His smooth, wet skin flushed a deeper gray as the aromas hit his sensory membranes. He was large, barrel-bodied, with the careful movements of someone accustomed to navigating spaces built for smaller species. He sat at the end of the long table and folded his smooth hands together with an expression of cautious hope. Demetria brought him Dalmaid's vegetation leaves wrapped around a grain and herb mixture. "I used rice instead of pine nuts," she told Veska, without being asked. "Their skin gets that dry look when something doesn't agree with them." The Palathi ate 1 dalma. His sensory membranes dilated. He ate a second. His hands, which had been folded with careful restraint, unfolded and reached for a third. By the 5th, his membranes were at their maximum aperture, the Palathi equivalent of leaning so far forward that you forgot you had a body. He looked at Demetria and said, in heavily accented common tongue, "This is not in any dietary guide I have received from your species." "It's not in any guide," Demetria said. "It's in my head." "Your head contains a very important thing," the Palathi said, and ate a 6th dalma. 2 young Turai traders arrived next, drawn by the smell from the commercial ring above. They were tall, thin-limbed, with the oversized membranous ears that Turai used for everything from temperature regulation to emotional expression. Their ears were already twitching when they came through the door. When Demetria served them strips of fried dough brushed with a honey analog and dusted with sesame, both traders' ear membranes went fully erect, a Turai expression of intense pleasure that they normally suppressed in public with the same determination that Veska suppressed involuntary palatal activation. One of them made a sound that the translator couldn't parse because it was too high-pitched for common tongue phonemes. The other gripped the table edge with both hands and stared at the remaining strips on the serving plate with the focused intensity of a predator sighting prey. The dock supervisor arrived next, a grenari of considerable size, crustacean-armored, with the articulated mandibles that his species used the way other species used eyebrows. His mandibles settled into the position that Veska had learned to read as suspended judgment, not for, not against, waiting for evidence. He was clearly a senior figure on the station. The Turai traders straightened when he entered, and the Palathi gave him a respectful nod. Demetria served him Laucomade's fried dough spheres drizzled with honey and cinnamon. The supervisor ate them with methodical precision, mandibles working in the steady rhythm of a professional conducting an assessment. When the plate was empty, he sat very still. Then he said, in the low mandibular register reserved for statements of serious personal weight, "My crew has been eating thermal-sealed nutrition blocks for 6 months. I had forgotten that food could do this." "Do what?" Veska asked. He considered the question. His mandibles worked, searching for the right configuration. "Make me not want to be somewhere else." A young Vorani deck officer appeared in the doorway, saw Veska and froze. She watched his crest feathers go through a rapid sequence: surprise, professional alarm, uncertainty about protocol before Demetria handed him a plate of spanakopita, and the crisis resolved. He sat at the far end of the table as far from Veska as the space allowed and took a cautious bite. Compound count when Veska ran a discrete scan, 671. The officer ate one piece, put his fork down and stared at his plate. He ate a second piece. His crest feathers rose involuntarily, the way Veska's palatal glands had activated at the exhibition. He ate a third piece and stopped pretending to maintain professional composure. Each one was a micro-payoff. Each one a crack in the confident assumption that Veska had brought with her from Veshtara Prime, the assumption that the scores were wrong and the system was right. Demetria fed Veska again. Something she called moussaka, a layered construction of sliced vegetable, ground meat, and the same dairy emulsion from the pasticcio, but arranged differently, with the vegetable providing a roasted sweetness that interacted with the meat compounds in a way that Veska's analyzer mapped as a fundamentally different flavor architecture from the pasticcio, despite sharing half its ingredients. The human had taken the same basic components and built two entirely different dishes, the way a musician used the same 12 notes to build different songs. Compound count, 1106. Higher than the pasticcio, not because the moussaka was more complex, it used fewer ingredients, but because the roasted vegetable had undergone a longer thermal treatment and had developed more interaction compounds. Time again. A priority message arrived on Veska's tablet from Deputy Chair Orvith. The Turai Culinary Academy has filed a formal protest regarding the competition results. They are requesting retroactive disqualification on grounds of inadequate equipment certification. The Vorani Collective at Station 173 has joined the protest. The Directorate Board meets in 4 days. They will expect your report. Please advise on timeline. Veska read it twice. She looked at the kitchen. She looked at the Palathi carefully folding his 9th dalma under Demetria's patient instruction. His smooth fingers clumsy but willing, learning a skill that had been passed from human grandmother to human grandmother and was now, in a cargo bay on a trading station, being passed to a species that had never heard of it. She typed, "Equipment certification is not a valid basis for disqualification. The exhibition charter requires only that the entry be prepared on site using the competitor's own technique. The human's technique does not require equipment. That is the finding so far." The reply came in 90 seconds. "Veska, I need a direct answer. Are you recommending that the scores stand?" She looked at her notes. 21 pages, 43 compound catalogs, 3 molecular scans of a sauce that defied its classification, 6 plates of food that had materially altered the trajectory of her formal review. She typed, "I am recommending that the Directorate's classification system be revised." She sent it. The reply came in under 30 seconds, which meant Orvith was sitting at his console waiting for her response, which meant the political pressure from the Turai and the Vorani Collective was worse than Veska had estimated. Revised how? The index has not been revised at the classification level in 214 years. The board meets in 4 days, Veska. The Turai are threatening to withdraw from next year's exhibition. The Vorani Collective at 173 has retained an advocacy firm. I need to know whether I'm defending the scores or overturning them. Veska looked at the message. She looked at Demetria Stavros, who was ladling sauce from the heavy-bottomed pot into a ceramic serving vessel, with the unconscious grace of a woman who had been ladling sauce since before the directorate's current classification framework was authored. She looked at the compound count on her analyzer, 1,341 and climbing, and at the list of unanswerable questions accumulating on her tablet. She typed, "Defend the scores. I will provide the basis." She closed the channel and did not open Orvith's subsequent 4 messages, the last of which was flagged urgent and began with the words, "The deputy chair of the Pelathi Enzyme Collective has also contacted us regarding." She did not care what the Pelathi deputy chair had contacted them about. She was watching Demetria explain something to the Granary dock supervisor, something about the honey drizzle on the laucomades, a technique that involved warming the honey to a specific temperature that the human described as, "when it flows like this, see, like water but slower," and which Veska's internal temperature estimation placed at precisely 43 degrees. A temperature that molecular analysis would confirm optimized the honey's viscosity for maximum adherence to the dough surface while maintaining its volatile aromatic compounds. The human did not know the number. She knew the flow. Veska stood up and walked to the thermal surface where the sauce was still simmering. She held her palm above it. She listened. The bubbling had changed slower, deeper, more settled than hours ago. She leaned close and breathed in. Her palatal glands cataloged compounds that hadn't been there at the last scan. She ran a final analysis. Compound count, 1,487, up from 1,341 90 minutes ago. The complexity was still climbing, but the rate of change was decreasing. It was approaching equilibrium. "You're listening to it," Demetria said from behind her. "I am taking aromatic measurements." "You're listening, and it's telling you what it tells me, another 20 minutes. "How do you know?" "Because that's when it stops changing. Right now it's still working things out. In 20 minutes it'll have figured out what it wants to be." Veska looked at the sauce. The reaction rate curve she could extrapolate from her 3 scans predicted equilibrium in approximately 20 minutes. The human was right. She was reading the same data Veska was reading. She was reading it with senses instead of machines, and she had names for the data listening, working things out, ready that were, in their crude way, accurate. The human was running an analog feedback system that had been optimized over centuries of iteration by thousands of cooks who had each added their own calibration data by standing next to their mothers and watching. The system had no documentation, no standardization, no quality control in any sense the directorate would recognize. It had something else instead: depth. The accumulated precision of 1,000 lifetimes of paying attention, compressed into a set of instincts that were transmitted not through manuals but through proximity, from hand to hand, mother to daughter, grandmother to granddaughter, in kitchens that would never pass a directorate inspection. Veska opened a new file on her tablet. Questions I cannot answer with current methodology. Question 1. Why does a 53-year-old human with no formal training produce compound depths that exceed Vorani masterclass kitchens by a factor of 4? Question 2. Why does the temporal architecture of her dishes read as deliberate to the scoring algorithm when no deliberate staging was applied? Question 3. Why did 9 judges from 7 species independently score a category 11K preparation in the top 4 of the exhibition's history? Question 4. Why am I on my 7th plate? She had a growing suspicion, and the suspicion was worse than any of the 3 explanations she had prepared on the transit. The equipment was not contaminated. The judges were not compromised. There was no error. The human's food was simply better. Mrs. Stavros, she said. Demi, I need to understand what the judges experienced, what I experienced. Demetria sat down across from her. The kitchen was full now, 7 species at the long tables, talking in a multilingual hum that the station's translation systems processed as overlapping contentment. What did you experience? The human asked. The question was genuine, no deflection. I experienced a preparation, Veska said slowly, choosing each word the way she chose evaluation scores, that contained more depth than my analytical training can account for. The compounds are measurable, the reactions are identifiable, but the architecture, the way they interact, the way they release in temporal sequence, the way the experience changes between the first moment and the last is not something molecular staging produces. Our techniques produce precision. Yours produces. She searched 12,000 Vorani gastronomic terms. Conversation. Not a scientific term, but the accurate one. Each bite was a conversation between compounds, a sustained dialogue that molecular cuisine never achieved, because precision told each compound exactly what to do, and conversation required that they figure it out together. Demetria nodded, not in triumph, in the way someone nods when they hear something they've always known expressed in language they've never used. My grandmother called it agape, she said. It doesn't translate well. The closest I can get is you don't cook the food, you convince it. Veska's stylus hovered. She did not write the word. The scores, Demetria said, are they going to stand? First time the human had asked. She hadn't asked at the exhibition. She hadn't asked in her interview response. She had served 7 species, improvised dietary accommodations without tools, taught a Pelathi to fold dolmades, and sung while doing it. Veska looked at her notes, 23 pages, 43 catalogs, 7 deviations from evaluation protocol, a file of unanswerable questions, the directorate's messages sitting unread, the Turais protest, the Vorani collective's protest, the 4 centuries of institutional framework resting on the assumption that culinary excellence was a function of molecular control. She looked at Demetria, who was already standing because the sound of the oil had changed. The human hadn't waited for the answer. The oil was ready. There were people at the table. That was what mattered. Mrs. Stavros, I came here to find the error in the scores. I know. There is no error. The flush on Demetria's face softened. The directorate categorizes your cuisine as 11K primitive subsistence preparations, thermal. That classification was established 200 years ago based on a survey of human colony rations, heated protein blocks, and rehydrated supplements. It has never been updated because no one thought it required investigation. The kitchen was quiet. The Pelathi had stopped folding. The Turai ears were still. The Granari mandibles were fixed. The young Vorani officer was watching Veska with the expression of someone witnessing a foundational statement. It requires updating. To what? Demetria asked. Veska's crest feathers rose slowly, the Vorani display that meant recognition. Full crest. She had felt it for the great Pelathi enzyme works, the Turai crystal gel masterpieces, the Vorani precision compositions that had defined galactic cuisine for 3 centuries. She had never expected to feel it in a cargo bay that smelled of rendered fat and cinnamon, and the good oregano, which was different from regular oregano in ways no analyzer could detect but which her palate could taste. I don't know, we don't have a classification for what you do. It isn't primitive. It isn't molecular. It predates our entire framework. It's cooking, just cooking. No, what my civilization does is just cooking. What the Pelathi do, the Turai, every species that has reduced food to a controlled chemical process, that is just cooking. What you do is, the word didn't exist in Vorani. The human had already given it to her. Agape. Demetria's eyes went bright. She pressed her lips together, nodded once and turned back. Sit, The baklava needs 10 more minutes. What is baklava? Layers of thin dough, walnuts, honey, butter. My grandmother's recipe, her grandmother's before that. Goes back so far nobody knows who started. 3 different countries on my planet claim they invented it. Demetria smiled a smile that carried weight, the kind that was attached to a specific memory of a specific person. My grandmother said they were all wrong. She said it invented itself because the ingredients wanted to be together. Your grandmother sounds like she had strong opinions. She had strong everything. She could make you sit down and eat with a look. She could make you cry with a piece of bread and butter. She came from a small village where everyone knew everyone, and when she cooked, the whole neighborhood came. Not because she invited them, because the smell went out the door and the door was always open, and people came because coming was what you did. Demetria paused, her hands still for the first time since Veska had entered the kitchen. She was looking at the thermal unit where the baklava was warming, but her eyes were somewhere else. When she died, the whole village came to her funeral, every single person. And they didn't bring flowers. They brought food. The dishes she taught them. 40 families, and every one of them had learned something from her kitchen. The priest said it was the biggest funeral the village had ever seen, and afterward there was a table in the square with food on it that went on for half a block. She turned back to Veska. That's what cooking is. It's not the molecules, it's not the temperature. It's the table and who's sitting at it and whether they come back. Veska looked at the long tables in Bay 14. 7 species. Every seat taken. The Palathi was teaching the Turai dock worker to fold dolmades. The Granari supervisor was eating his 3rd plate of laukumades with an expression of concentrated reverence. The young Vorani officer had abandoned all pretense of professional distance and was asking Demetria how long to knead bread dough. They had come, they were sitting, they were coming back. How many layers? 40. 40 layers by hand. Each one brushed with butter. Each one a little different because hands aren't machines, and that's the point. Veska sat. She closed her formal evaluation notes permanently. She opened a new file, addendum to the Vorani Flavor Index, proposed reclassification of human culinary arts. The baklava came out 10 minutes later. Demetria cut it with a blade that moved through the layers with the precision of 10,000 repetitions, and drizzled warm honey over the cut pieces. The kitchen filled with a scent that Veska's analyzer cataloged as 412 volatiles in a temporal release pattern. Bright honey and citrus top notes, warm nutmeg and butter mid-notes, and a deep, slow, toasted grain finish that lingered for 11 seconds. 11 seconds. Molecular desserts averaged 3. A piece appeared in front of Veska. Golden brown, glistening, 40 layers visible in cross-section like geological strata, the crushed walnuts nestled between them. She ate it without her probe, without clinical mode. She ate it with her taloned hands, with whatever Vorani equivalent she had for the thing happening in her chest, not a cardiac event, not an emotion her species had formally named, but something that sounded, if she was being honest with herself for the first time in a very long career, a lot like agape. The 40 layers were each distinct under her palatal grid. Each one carried its own character, a slightly different butter saturation, a slightly different crispness, a slightly different interaction with the walnut fragments and the honey syrup. It was not uniformity. A molecular pastry chef would have made each layer identical, because uniformity was precision and precision was excellence. These layers were not identical. They were a family. Each one related to the others, each one contributing something slightly different to the whole. The way voices in a chorus were not identical but were, together, something that no single voice could be alone. The Palathi ate a piece and sat very still. His sensory membranes darkened to the shade of gray that meant overwhelmed. He held the edge of the table with both hands. After a long silence, he said, to no one in particular, "I would like to learn how to make this." Demetria heard him. "Come back tomorrow morning," she said. "I'll show you the dough." "The dough takes skill," the Palathi said. It was half a question. "The dough takes patience," Demetria said. "Skill comes after." The granary supervisor ate 2 pieces. He ate them with the same methodical precision he had applied to every dish, but his mandibles were no longer in the assessment position. They were in a configuration that Veska recognized from granary ethnographic files as the posture of gratitude, a rarely documented expression that most xenobiologists believed had been socialized out of the species during their industrial period. He asked, quietly, if he could come back tomorrow. When Demetria said, "Every day," his mandibles trembled and he looked away, and Veska understood that the granary word for what was happening to him was probably as untranslatable as agape. The Torai traders ate 4 pieces each. They did not ask to come back. They simply did not leave. The young Vorani officer ate 1 piece, put it down, and stared at the cross-section of the baklava for a long time, the visible layers, the golden honey, the walnut fragments held in suspension between sheets of dough that a woman's hands had brushed with butter one at a time. He looked at Veska. "Chair 7, he said very quietly. "What do I write in my personal log?" "The truth," Veska said, "whatever the truth is for you." His crest feathers rose slowly, involuntarily, the way they did when the Vorani body recognized something that the Vorani mind had not yet formulated. He ate a 2nd piece. He did not look at her again, because looking at her would have required him to acknowledge that his crest was at full display, and that he had no professional justification for it. And acknowledging that would have meant admitting that the institutional framework in which he had been trained, and in which he intended to build his career, had just been quietly, fundamentally, and irreversibly called into question by 40 layers of dough, walnuts, and honey assembled by a 53-year-old woman who measured nothing and knew everything. Veska sat in the kitchen that smelled of fat and cinnamon and honey and centuries, and watched Demetria serve a human dessert to 6 species, singing, moving between the tables with the confidence of someone who had never needed a committee's approval, because the proof was in every face at every table. She understood what the judges had scored. Not complexity, not precision, not technique. Something passed from hand to hand for centuries, in kitchens without tools, by people who measured by feel and knew the oil by its sound, and called the main ingredient time, and who never needed the Vorani flavor index because the index was a map, and what they had was the territory itself. She opened her tablet one last time. Under the addendum title, from Category 11K Primitive Subsistence Preparations, Thermal, to Uncategorized Sovereign Tradition. First time in 4 centuries that sovereign had been applied to a cuisine. The term meant, in Vorani regulatory language, a practice so fundamentally distinct from existing classifications that it could not be ranked against them, only acknowledged. The directorate would fight it, Presk would demand hearings, the Turai would press their protest, the molecular purists would call it a scandal, the argument would last years. Veska looked at the empty plate. A thin film of honey remained, catching the kitchen light, golden and slow. She did not care. The scores were going to stand, and the index was going to change. And somewhere in a cargo bay kitchen on a mid-tier trading station, a 53-year-old human with flour on her cheek was teaching the galaxy that the most sophisticated culinary technique in 900 species collective history was a grandmother's hands, an unlicensed oven, and enough time for the flavors to learn each other's names.